good night. So this is all about normal tonight. And there's no better place to talk about normal and redefining your normal than Maplewood, New Jersey. Because we're this diverse community of creative people doing all these amazing things. Except it's not always that easy. We have careers, we have commutes, we have mortgages, we have kids in school, we have vacations to plan. And so redefining your normal and changing your life becomes a little harder year by year. You know, the stakes are really high. What if you leave your job and start a business and it doesn't work out and you still have bills to pay? Or what if you decide to leave your job entirely and go to school and study something new and take your life in a different direction? The stakes are really high, even in a place like Maplewood. But tonight, I'm going to ask you to look at it in a different way. Because I believe when you take a chance, you try something new and follow your heart, you don't just change your own life. You change the lives of others around you in profound ways. So I'm going to tell you a story. This is Ben Carlin. Ben was an extraordinary person. He grew up in Western Australia in the 1920s, and from the outside, it seemed like he had a pretty normal life, even a better than normal life. He went to one of the best private schools. He got academic awards. He was a star athlete. And it was no surprise to anyone that he was accepted to law school. Except Ben had different ideas about what was normal. After just a year in law school, he dropped out. He went out to the gold fields of Western Australia to work with his hands and mine for gold. And along the way, he got in bar fights. He got arrested a few times. And when that normal was a little too normal, he moved on. He hopped a freighter to China, where he worked in a coal mine outside Shanghai. When World War II broke out, he enlisted in the Indian Army, served for a while, did time in a secret espionage unit. And when the war was over, and it seemed like Ben had exhausted almost every opportunity to redefine his normal, he saw this strange vehicle on a military base. This is a Ford GPA. It's basically an Army Jeep wrapped in a boat shell with a propeller on back. And it was developed by the American Army during the war as a sort of experimental vehicle. And the idea was that if a soldier was driving across the battlefield and came to a creek or a river, he could just putter across and keep going. Well, it was a good idea, but the reality was the Jeep tended to sink. So not many were made, and it was generally considered a failure. Ben didn't know that. When he saw this Jeep, he knew what his next act was going to be. He was going to drive one around the world. As you do. Ben tracked one down, spent a summer building a cabin over the top, adding a few extra fuel tanks. And in the summer of 1948, just 15 miles from here in Lower Manhattan, he drove into the Hudson River, took a left, and headed out into the Atlantic. Now, pretty soon he discovered why the Jeep hadn't been considered a great success. The radio died. Soon after that, the engine died, and Ben drifted for a week before he was miraculously spotted by a passing freighter and rescued. But he was undeterred. He kept going. When he arrived in Europe, he was greeted with shock and surprise and disbelief. He was briefly famous. He was in Life magazine. He was in the New York Times. He was interviewed by the BBC. And he kept going. Through the deserts of North Africa and the Middle East, where he was set upon by bandits and the temperature inside the Jeep soared to 160 degrees. Through jungles of Southeast Asia and across the icy North Pacific. Into Alaska and Canada, where people didn't know what to make of him, and snowdrifts would tower higher than the Jeep. And finally, back to New York. It was a journey that he thought would take only 6 months. It took 10 years and nearly killed him. As soon as I heard about Ben, I became obsessed. I wanted to know everything I could about this man. Why did he do this? What drove him? Who was he? I tracked down friends and relatives. I went to Australia to spend time with his daughter. I pored over journals and letters and spent time in archives and libraries. Eventually, I wrote a book about him. But even though I'd become the world expert on this obscure adventurer, I still didn't understand something. I didn't understand why his story grabbed me so much. I didn't understand why it mattered. Well, I started thinking about it, and something dawned on me. You know, you don't drive a Jeep like this around the world by yourself. That would be crazy. There was almost always somebody in the passenger seat. His first co-pilot was his wife, Eleanor. Eleanor grew up poor in Boston. Her parents were Italian immigrants who never learned to speak English. And Eleanor never really thought that she would do much with her life. Then she met Ben. They spent their honeymoon in the Jeep. Life changed forever. Now, life in a Jeep isn't for everyone. She only made it as far as Afghanistan before they parted ways. But her time with Ben changed her. She moved to New York. She focused on her career. And by the 1970s, Eleanor was the first woman to head hiring at a Manhattan law firm. Ben's next co-pilot was Barry Hanley, a 25-year-old railway draftsman from West Australia. Barry didn't have a lot going on in his life, and when he heard about Ben, he raised his hand and volunteered to sail with him from Burma to Japan. It was some of the toughest traveling because they had to go through the jungles of Southeast Asia. Years later, Barry's widow told me that his time with Ben had enlarged his sense of himself and what was possible. Barry ended up returning to Australia, founded an architectural firm that became one of the biggest in the country. His final co-pilot, who sailed with him across the North Pacific, was a young American from a small hamlet in West Virginia without electricity or running water. He raised his hand, volunteered to sail with Ben, spent the entire crossing in abject terror, thinking that they were going to go down. But when they finally touched ground in Alaska right here, Boyd Dement had found that he too was changed, so much so that he wrote a book about his adventure, and another, and he went on to write 100 books and became an expert on things like the business culture of Japan. And there was one more person in Ben's life. Go back to 1947 or 1946 when Ben was renting an apartment in Annapolis, Maryland, and working on this Jeep, putting the cabin around it. And a young 14-year-old boy named George used to stop by and listen to his tales of adventure and travel. And they sparked George's curiosity and helped enlarge his sense of the world. George went on to study ancient history, and in college, and he thought, you could probably learn a lot about ancient history through shipwrecks. So, as one does, he founded the field of underwater archaeology, discovered the oldest shipwrecks in the world, and went on to become, in the words of Time magazine, the Indiana Jones of underwater archaeology. And George was my dad. So in that moment, it hit me. The point of Ben's story was not what he did, it's the lives he touched. He gave others permission to redefine their normal and to take chances and to take a leap into the unknown. Well, I have to admit something. When I was preparing this talk, it made sense, but it still seemed a little academic, a little theoretical. Because look, who am I to talk about redefining your normal? I'm a Maplewood dad with a mortgage and a career and a commute into the city and a laundry list of ideas and dreams that I haven't pursued. Sound familiar? Last month, I went to Indonesia. I went to Bali. And I visited the Green School, which is this school in the jungle that's built of bamboo. And it's dedicated to sustainability and teaching kids to be good global citizens and prepare them for the future. Families come from all over the world so their kids can study at the Green School. I thought it would be a great place for my kids to grow and thrive and see the world in a different way. But even when I was there, I thought, you know what? That's just another dream. We can't do that. And then on my last day in Bali, I was walking down a path under the hot sun between two rice fields, and a woman on a scooter stopped me to ask for directions. She told me that she was from Norway, and she'd worked in marketing like me, and She had ideas for projects that she wanted to pursue, but Norway wasn't the place to do it. And besides, those Scandinavian winters were getting cold and long. So she sold her house. And with her 5-year-old daughter, she'd moved to Bali, which she thought would be a great place to start something new. And right then, she gave me permission to do the same thing. That's the idea. Because when you redefine what's normal, when you make a change in your life, when you follow your heart, you set into motion these ripples that go throughout the world. Ben set them off, and they went outward and touched people like my father and eventually me. And I hope they go out and affect you, and then you go on to do great things and change the world. So if I can ask you one thing, it's to follow your heart, take chances, take a leap into the unknown. Because when you do so, you won't just change your life, you will change the world. Thank you.